In the 12th century, when England was still raw from the wounds of conquest and rebellion, when superstition clung to every hearth and shadows stretched long across the fields of Suffolk, there lay a small village called Woolpit, its name taken from the wolf pits dug deep into the earth to trap the wild beasts that once prowled the countryside, and it was here that something strange, something unholy or miraculous, depending on whom one asked, came to pass, an event whispered first in fear among peasants, and then recorded with ink-stained quills by monks who could not decide if they were chronicling truth, allegory, or the devil's mischief. And it began on a harvest day, the sun hidden behind a pale veil of mist that rose from the fens, when peasants bent low among the barley heard cries that were not the calls of birds nor the shouts of their fellows, but something thin and pitiful, as though a wounded creature sought refuge at the edge of the wolf pits. And a woman named Agnes, known for gathering kindling near the fields, was the first to stumble upon the source of the cries, dropping her basket of sticks in terror as she beheld two children crouching among the thickets, a boy and a girl, their clothes rough and woven of a material unfamiliar to her eyes, their hair unkempt, and their skin, God preserve us, strangely green, a pallor like nettles or unripe fruit that made her heart quake, and she screamed, drawing the men from the fields, who came armed with hoes and pitchforks, expecting thieves or vagabonds, only to stop in astonishment at the sight. For the children were unlike any they had seen, their lips moving in a rush of words that belonged to no tongue known in England, neither the French of the lords nor the English of the peasants, nor scraps of Norse that lingered among the Eastern folk, but a liquid speech that seemed to dance on their lips, incomprehensible and unsettling. And while the girl clung fiercely to the boy, both looked at the villagers with wide, desperate eyes, as if they had stumbled from a nightmare into another. And the men muttered oaths, some making the sign of the cross, others spitting to ward off evil, and yet curiosity outweighed fear. So they led the children toward the manor hall of Sir Richard de Calne, Lord of Woolpit, who looked upon them with his usual sternness, his dark eyes measuring them though they were livestock brought for inspection, and when food was set before them, bread coarse with bran, cheese sharp from age, and a slab of salted meat, they recoiled, shaking their heads, clutching one another and turning away with an expression almost of horror. Yet when fresh beanstalks were brought in from the garden and the pods torn open, the children seized them with trembling hands and devoured them raw, juice spilling down their chins, eyes wild with hunger, and the villagers, watching, whispered that these were no Christian children but sprites, or perhaps demons sent to test their faith, and the priest, Father Alwyn, urged that they be baptized immediately, for holy water would reveal their true nature. And though Sir Richard hesitated, not wishing to invite trouble upon his household, the murmurs of his people grew loud, and so the children were brought into the smoky, candle-lit church, where incense stung the air and the carved Christ loomed above the altar. And as the priest poured the cold water upon their heads, the children wailed as though in pain, clutching at each other. Yet the rite was completed, and afterward they lay exhausted upon the floor, their green skin damp with tears, and some said it seemed less vivid than before, as though the water had drawn some of the unnatural hue away, though others swore this was but imagination. And in the days that followed, the girl began slowly to pick up words of English, cautious, halting, as a bird learns to mimic a song, while the boy remained weaker, his appetite uncertain, his eyes sunken, and though he too learned fragments of speech, his voice was faint, and his body frail, and despite the beans he ate, strength did not return to him, and the villagers, curious and fearful, pressed the girl with questions as her tongue grew more confident, demanding to know from whence she and her brother had come, and her answers chilled the marrow of all who heard them, for she spoke of a place she called the land of St. Martin, where all were Christians yet the world was not as theirs, where the light was dim and twilight reigned eternal, the sky never bright with sun, the earth lush with greenery though touched by no dawn or noon. And when pressed, she said that she and her brother had been tending their father's flock when they followed the beasts into a cavern, wandering long in the darkness until at last they saw a great light ahead, and when they stumbled out, they found themselves not in their homeland but in Woolpit, with the sound of church bells ringing in their ears, And at this, the villagers crossed themselves and shuddered, some muttering that no such place could exist save in hell or purgatory, and that the children were messengers of the devil, while others clung to the hope that God had revealed a hidden mystery of his creation. A land veiled from the eyes of men, yet always, beneath their words, there was fear, for what could be trusted if such strange folk could appear unbidden in their fields, green of skin and babbling in tongues unknown? And the boy's health waned as whispers spread, his coughs growing harsher, his limbs thinner, until one morning he did not rise, and the girl's cries echoed through the manor hall, mournful and desperate. And though Father Alwyn insisted he be buried in consecrated ground, others protested, fearful that the earth itself would sour, yet the priest prevailed, and the boy was laid to rest in the churchyard, though villagers avoided his grave, convinced the soil was cursed, and the girl, bereft, remained alone, clinging now to the people of Woolpit as her only tether. And as months passed, her skin lost some of its unnatural hue, though never fully, and her eyes still gleamed with a strangeness that made even kind-hearted women uneasy. Yet she learned their tongue, she learned to eat their food, and she grew stronger, until she became outwardly almost like them, though always not quite. Always a reminder of that terrible day when she and her brother had crawled from the edge of the pits, and the story spread beyond Woolpit, carried by travelers and merchants to Bury St. Edmunds, where monks copied the tale, and from there further still, until it reached William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, who would one day record it, though even they could not decide whether it was truth or allegory, miracle or fraud. But for the villagers who had seen with their own eyes, the green children who had heard their strange tongue and watched the boy wither and die, it was no tale, no allegory, but a memory etched deep into their bones, a mystery that haunted their nights. And as the girl grew, she continued to speak of her homeland, repeating the tale of the twilight world, the cavern, the bells. And though she lived, though she even began to laugh and sing and take part in the rhythms of the village, she was always apart, and the wolf pits themselves became a place of terror. For who could say what lay beneath the earth, what tunnels or caverns yawned unseen? And children were forbidden to play near them, though still some dared, peering into the black mouths of the pits and swearing they heard whispers rising from below. And when one boy fell and broke his arm upon the jagged stones, his mother screamed that the green demons had cursed him. And so pits, once only traps for beasts, became symbols of dread, reminders of the children who had come forth from the shadows. And in the long winters, when firelight flickered and wind howled through the thatch, the people of Woolpit told the story to hush their own children into obedience, warning them that if they strayed too far, the green ones would take them, or worse, that they themselves might vanish into the caverns and re-emerge in another world, never to return. And though the girl grew into a woman, lived among them, and even served in households beyond Woolpit, her presence was never ordinary, for she carried with her always the weight of that strangeness, the memory of the boy who had died, and the haunting, unanswerable question of what land of twilight she had once called home. Yet even as she lingered in Woolpit and the seasons turned, the sense of unease never departed, for the villagers could not look upon her without recalling that day at the pits, and though her English grew fluent and her manners softened into those of her new home, something always clung to her like the shadow of another world, and some said it was her skin, which though less green, still bore a tint, a faint hue in certain lights that no baptism could wash away, while others swore it was her eyes, watchful and strange, as though they had seen things no mortal child should. And the people whispered among themselves that the girl carried a curse, that Woolpit itself might bear the burden of her presence. And in the long evenings when men gathered in the smoky hall to drink ale, they debated what she truly was, some insisting she must be the child of travelers from distant lands who had been lost in the fens and poisoned by strange herbs, others muttering that she was of the Fae, left behind as a cruel trick, and the more fearful claimed she and her brother had crawled from hell itself, the wolf pits being no mere traps but openings to the underworld. And so suspicion followed her as closely as her own shadow. But still she survived, and in time her tongue loosened further, and she gave more detail of her strange homeland, telling of fields as green as woolpits yet bathed in a dim light as though the sun were forever rising but never risen. A twilight world where all was cool and hushed, where the people worshipped Saint Martin and knew nothing of blazing day her new companions took for granted, and she said again how she and her brother, tending sheep, had heard bells in the distance, followed the sound into a cavern, wandered long in the dark until the light broke upon them, and found themselves in Woolpit, and though she spoke with conviction, no one believed fully, for how could such a place exist, and yet they feared to call her a liar, for what if her words were truth, and to doubt them was to invite God's wrath? And so the tale spread with her as its reluctant vessel, and it grew with each telling, becoming larger than the girl herself, until Woolpit was known not only as a village of wolf pits, but as the place where the green children had appeared, and strangers came to peer at her, to hear her story, to gape at her skin and mutter among themselves, and she bore it all with a quiet endurance, though those who watched closely said she flinched when she heard church bells, as though the sound recalled that passage through darkness, and when storms rolled over the fields and the sky darkened, she sometimes stared eastward, lips moving with words unspoken, as if remembering her brother and the land they had left, and grief hung upon her though she smiled when spoken to, and the people, though unsettled, began to weave her into their daily life, for she was there and she lived, and even fear grows dull with familiarity, yet beneath it all, in the marrow of their bones, the dread remained, and no season passed when someone did not mention the wolf pits in hushed tones, wondering what other things might crawl forth, and in this way the girl became both a living member of Woolpit and its most enduring omen, and as her youth stretched toward womanhood, and she grew into her limbs and features, tension sharpened, for some saw her beauty despite the strangeness, and others saw only danger, and so she stood always apart, a child of two worlds, bearing within her the silence of a twilight land that none of her new kin could comprehend, and the memory of her brother, buried beneath the earth of Woolpit, whom she alone mourned with tears unending, and thus part one of her story closes not with resolution, but with the deepening of mystery, for though she lived, her very existence was a question none could answer, and Woolpit itself seemed less a village and more a threshold, a place where the familiar world brushed against the unknown, and in the hearts of those who remembered the day she and her brother stumbled from the thickets, fear lingered, whispering that perhaps the green children were not merely lost, but sent, emissaries of a hidden realm, reminders that the earth itself held secrets best left undisturbed. The days after the boy's burial were heavy with silence, a silence that seemed to seep into the very earth of Woolpit, for though the villagers went about their labors, tending the barley and flax, mending roofs, driving cattle, there was always the memory of that strange grave in the churchyard. And each time the bell tolled it seemed to echo not only for the dead, but for something unseen, as if warning the living that they dwelt too close to mysteries best left alone. And the girl, though she lingered in Sir Richard's hall and learned each day more of their tongue, carried with her the shadow of that silence, speaking little and watching much, and in the night she often woke screaming, her cries muffled by the rushes on which she slept. And when women came to comfort her, she clutched at them with desperate hands, whispering words half in English, half in the strange liquid tongue of her homeland, words no one could understand, yet the grief in them was plain, and though the villagers pitied her, pity could not erase fear, for each time they looked upon her faintly green skin, each time they remembered the strange story she had told, they shuddered, and some muttered that perhaps it was mercy the boy had not lived, for what demon's work might have grown in him had he reached manhood, and others said the girl too should have been buried beside him before she could bring ruin upon them. But none dared speak so openly before Sir Richard, who insisted she remain, whether from a sense of Christian duty, curiosity, or some darker compulsion, no one could guess, and so she stayed, and the story of her grew, until strangers began to arrive from other villages, pilgrims of curiosity more than of faith, pressing to see her, to hear her speak, and she endured their gazes with a quiet unease, her words halting but clear enough to repeat her tale of the twilight land, the cavern, the bells, and the sudden bursting forth into Woolpit. And with each telling her voice grew stronger, Yet with each telling the villagers' dread deepened, for her story never changed, never wavered, and that constancy made it harder to dismiss as mere invention. And Father Olwyn, troubled, sought to test her with Holy Scripture, reading aloud passages of the Gospels and asking her to repeat them, and she did, stumbling at first, then more fluently, until the priest admitted that she was indeed Christian in word, if not in origin, though this gave little comfort. For if she was of the faith, then from what realm of God's creation had she come, and why had he sent her? And though Olwyn preached that perhaps God revealed in her the vastness of his works, others in secret muttered that she was a punishment for their sins, a reminder that hell lay nearer than they thought, and so suspicion lingered, fed by her strangeness, for she still ate beans above all else, though now she touched bread and milk, and sometimes even meat. Yet she consumed them with a hesitance, though unfamiliar, and her eyes often strayed to the wolf pits, dark and yawning at the edge of the fields, and more than once children swore they saw her standing there at dusk, gazing down into the earth as though waiting for someone. And when confronted, she said only that she listened. Sometimes she thought she heard bells echoing from below, and at this the villagers crossed themselves and dragged their children away, for who could know what might still lie beneath those pits? And the rumors spread of a twilight world beneath the earth, of tunnels and caverns leading to realms best left unnamed. And though the girl lived among them, learning their ways, growing into her limbs, she was always marked, always the other, the green girl of Woolpit, the survivor of a mystery that refused to fade. And as her voice strengthened and her mind sharpened, she spoke more of her homeland, describing rivers that gleamed faintly in the dim light, crops that grew in strange rhythms, and people who lived in quiet order beneath the gaze of Saint Martin. And when pressed on why she had left, she shook her head, saying only that she had followed the cattle into the cavern, and that once she emerged she could not return. And tears filled her eyes when she spoke of her brother, the only companion who had shared that journey, now lost to the grave. And though the villagers pitied her grief, their fear only grew, for the more she spoke, the more vivid the image of that other world became, and it haunted their dreams, a land beside their own yet hidden, a place where children could vanish and return changed. And in the long winter nights, when wolves howled in the distance and the pits gaped black beneath the snow, mothers clutched their children close and whispered prayers, for none could say whether more green children might crawl forth, or whether their own might vanish into the earth and re-emerge speaking tongues no one knew. And thus Woolpit lived with both wonder and dread, and the girl, though she survived, was the vessel of both. And as the seasons turned, the girl began to grow taller, her skin paling slowly from its once vivid green to a faint olive hue, though never entirely losing its strange tint. And this fading only deepened the villagers' unease, for they wondered if it meant she was slowly becoming one of them, or if it meant she was losing some hidden power, some strange protection that had allowed her to cross between worlds. And though she learned to laugh with the other children, running in the meadows and chasing geese, there remained a distance, as if she stood always half in shadow, for when others sang she often fell silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon, and when asked what she thought of, she would say she dreamed of rivers that flowed without sun, of fields lit by a dim glow as if dawn had been frozen in place, and of voices singing hymns in a tongue the villagers could not know. And when pressed she fell silent again, biting her lip until blood welled, and some said she lied, inventing such visions to frighten them, but others whispered that the devil himself had planted those memories in her. And one night, when storm clouds blotted the moon, the miller's wife swore she saw the girl standing alone in the churchyard, her hands spread over her brother's grave, murmuring words in that liquid tongue. And though the woman dared not draw near, she claimed the earth trembled faintly beneath her feet, as if something moved far below. And this tale spread quickly, feeding the fires of suspicion, and men began to say aloud that Sir Richard had done wrong to keep her, that she brought danger upon them, yet none dared act, for she was under his protection, and he had long served their lords faithfully. And still the girl remained, growing into a young woman of curious beauty, her eyes bright but always haunted. And though she began to eat all manner of food, though she joined in the feasts and knelt in the church. The villagers never ceased to speak of her origin, and whenever famine or sickness struck, they pointed fingers, whispering that she had cursed them. And though no proof was ever found, fear has little need of proof, and thus she lived always at the edge of their acceptance, tolerated but never embraced, pitied yet mistrusted, and as years passed she revealed more of her tale, not in great confessions but in fragments, dropped like crumbs, those who cared to listen, telling of a land where the air was heavy and still, where daylight never came but shadows stretched long and unbroken, where people worked their fields in silence and spoke only in hymns, where bells rang not from towers but from deep caverns that shook the earth. And when she spoke of this, her voice took on a strange cadence, half song, half prayer, and though her listeners understood little, they felt the hair rise upon their arms, for there was a conviction in her words that no child could feign, and some began to believe that she truly had come from another realm, neither heaven nor hell, but something in between, a borderland of souls. And though the priest cautioned against such thoughts, saying it was but a tale shaped by grief and fear, even he grew quiet when she repeated the Lord's Prayer in her strange tongue, for though the words were alien, the cadence matched, as though faith itself spanned worlds, and this unsettled him more than if she had denied the prayer entirely. For what did it mean if other lands beneath the earth worshipped the same God, and yet lived in endless twilight, cut off from the sun? And so the question of her origin lingered unsolved, gnawing at Woolpit like a rat in the granary, and the girl, though she tried to live, though she learned their customs, could never escape the shadow of that question. And each year on the feast of St. Martin she wept bitterly, shutting herself away until her cries softened into silence, and when asked why, she only said that her people had once celebrated him too, and that on that day she remembered them. And the villagers, hearing this, grew more fearful still, for what did it mean if beneath their very feet dwelt another folk who worshipped the same saints, who lived in a world parallel to their own yet unseen? And so her life became a balance of survival and isolation, and though she worked, though she spoke, though she grew, she remained forever apart, the green girl, the child from the earth, the one who had come from shadows and brought shadows with her. And though her brother's grave lay still untouched, some swore they heard faint tapping from beneath it on cold winter nights, as if a hand still knocked from below, and though no one dared to dig, they whispered that perhaps he had not died at all, but returned to the place from which he came, leaving her stranded forever between two worlds, neither claimed fully by one nor welcomed by the other. And so part 2 of her tale closes in sorrow, with a girl grown but never free, marked by the memory of her brother, by the whispers of villagers, and by the endless question of what world she had truly left behind, a question that centuries could never bury. For even now the story is told, and even now Woolpit remembers. And so the years passed like drifting clouds over Suffolk, and the girl who had once stumbled starved into the fields with skin as green as nettles grew into a woman who bore within her the tension of two worlds. Yet in Woolpit she could never shed the title of outsider, for the villagers, though they relied on her labor, though they heard her prayers in their church, though they shared bread with her at feast days, never failed to whisper when her back was turned, never failed to note that she did not laugh as freely as others, that she stared too long into wells as if listening for voices, that her skin, though paled, was never the same hue as theirs, that her eyes caught glimmers of torchlight strangely, and that her sorrow seemed endless. And in truth she carried a sorrow deeper than any of them could imagine, for though she tried to forget the cavernous land of her birth, though she told herself that England was her home now, she often dreamt of her brother, not as he had died but as he had lived, running with her in the dim fields, their hands clasped, their voices echoing in hymns that rose like smoke into an unseen vault. And when she woke she often found herself weeping into the straw, whispering words in the old tongue, words that frightened even her, for they called to something she no longer fully understood. And it was during these years of belonging, of living at the edge of acceptance, that the story of the Green Children began to grow beyond Woolpit itself, carried by wandering friars who sought tales to warn or inspire. carried by merchants who spun strange rumors for coin, carried even by clerks who set quills to parchment, eager to record marvels that proved the world was wider than men dared to think, and in their retellings, the truth of the girl's life bent and warped, for some said she was a fairy changeling, others said she was a witch's child, others said she was an omen sent by God to remind men of mysteries still hidden, and though she knew nothing of these tales, they shaped how strangers treated her, for when pilgrims passed through Woolpit on their way to shrines, some would cross themselves when they saw her, others would try to pluck hairs from her head for charms, others would beg her to speak in her strange tongue as if it held prophecy, and though she longed to vanish, she endured, for Sir Richard still offered her protection, though he too grew wary, for lords prefer no disturbances in their villages, and her presence was disturbance enough. Yet she repaid his kindness with labor, working his household with diligence, never shirking, though her heart was elsewhere, and it was during one particularly hard winter, when the wells froze and cattle perished, that murmurs against her grew sharpest, for men said the frost came because she was here, that her alien blood had angered heaven, and one night when wind howled like wolves, a group of young men, drunk on ale and fear, came to her dwelling, pounding the door, shouting that she must leave, that she had cursed their fields, that if she stayed longer all would starve, and though she trembled within, she did not cry out, she did not flee, she only placed her hand upon the wooden cross that hung by her bed and prayed silently, until at last they departed. But the next morning she found a dead lamb nailed to her door, its blood frozen in the cold, and she knew then that Woolpit would never truly be home, that even if her skin grew as pale as theirs, even if she bore their children, she would remain forever the green girl. Forever watched with suspicion, and this knowledge cut deeper than the winter's bite, and in her grief she returned to the churchyard where her brother lay, falling to her knees, pressing her hands to the soil, whispering in that other tongue for hours until her lips went numb, and some who passed claimed they saw a faint glow upon the ground, though whether from lantern light or from something else none could say. And as she prayed, she felt a tremor run through her body, as if the earth beneath stirred, as if her brother heard her still, and she rose with trembling hands, whispering that she must find the place again, the place from which they had come, for only there could her heart rest, and thus began her secret search, wandering the woods at dusk, peering into hollows, listening at wells, asking travelers of strange caverns, always hoping to find a path back, though she knew it was hopeless, for that door had opened only once and would not open again, yet still she searched, and villagers noticed her wanderings, fueling their suspicions further, and rumors spread that she communed with spirits, that she plotted mischief, and once more the priest intervened, speaking kindly to her, urging her to accept the life God had given, urging her to forget the shadows of her birth. But she only bowed her head and said softly that forgetting was a kind of death, and she had already lost too much. And so the years continued, a cycle of toil, suspicion, longing, and sorrow, until one day a knight passing through the region heard of her story and, curious, asked to see her. And when he looked upon her he marveled, saying she bore the mark of enchantment, and he offered to take her into his household, to carry her away from Woolpit. And though Sir Richard hesitated, perhaps weary of the burden she had become, he agreed, and so the girl left Woolpit behind, her fate entwined with larger powers now, and yet the village never forgot her. For even after she was gone, strange things continued to stir in the fields, lights seen at night, voices heard near wells, cattle found restless for no cause, and villagers whispered that the girl had left part of herself behind, that Woolpit was forever marked by the day two green children stumbled from the earth, one to die, one to linger, and though centuries would pass, the story would not fade, for it had already taken root in the minds of all who heard, growing like ivy, impossible to cut away. The girl of Woolpit, though she had now been some years among the people of the village and her English tongue had grown as fluid as that of any native child, continued to bear the mark of her otherness, for memory of her brother lingered as a wound that never healed, and the whispers about her never ceased, so that she walked each day in a world half accepting and half suspicious, and in that tension her spirit hardened, making her thoughtful beyond her years, for she seemed always to weigh her words and glance around her as if measuring the trust of those who heard her. And it was in these years that the tale of the green children spread beyond Woolpit, carried by merchants who stopped for drink or shelter, told again at fairs and markets where strangers gathered to barter, until Suffolk itself became known as the land where strange children from another world had once appeared, and though some called it a curiosity, others felt a shiver, for the story touched upon the deep fears of medieval men, fears of liminal places, of pits and caverns, of the border between this world and the next, where the line between natural and supernatural blurred, and in this way the girl's very life became a legend she could not escape. For even as she grew tall and shed the last faint traces of green that clung to her skin, she remained in the minds of those around her not a maiden of flesh and blood, but a reminder of mystery, and though she tried to live simply, to tend fields and spin wool as the other girls did, her presence could not help but stir unease, for she was tied to a tale larger than herself, and the people of Woolpit, though pious, were steeped in superstition, and they looked upon her with both pity and dread, for she embodied the unknown, and the unknown is seldom loved. And yet as seasons turned and harvests passed, she found herself drawn more and more to the places where the land seemed to speak with a voice older than the plough and the church bell, wandering by the edges of the pits where she had first been found, staring into the shadowed hollows as if the earth itself concealed memories she could almost recall, though never clearly, and when she asked the villagers if anyone had ever climbed down into those strange depressions, they shook their heads with alarm, for to descend into a place so steep and damp was to court death, and worse than death perhaps, for pits were thought to be mouths of the underworld, traps where the devil might seize a soul. Yet the girl could not shake her fascination, and in the solitude of early dawn she sometimes stole away, her bare feet brushing the wet grass, and stood at the rim until her heart raced with a mixture of dread and longing, as if she were being called, though by whom or what she dared not guess, and the dreams that haunted her only deepened this pull, for she began to see again her brother, not as she remembered him in life but changed, pale and thin, his eyes hollow and glimmering with a light not of this world, reaching for her yet always beyond reach, and each time she awoke gasping, the echo of his voice still in her ears, speaking in that forgotten tongue she could no longer understand, a tongue that twisted like birdsong and sighing wind. And though she longed to know its meaning, when she tried to mimic the sounds aloud in waking life, she found her lips clumsy, her memory treacherous, and the words would not come, as if some power had sealed away the key to her origins, leaving her stranded between two worlds forever. And when she confided this to the priest of Woolpit, he grew grave and warned her that such visions might be temptations sent by dark spirits, urging her to pray more fervently and confess her sins. Yet she knew in her soul it was not sin but memory that stirred within her, for she carried within her veins something ancient and inexplicable, and no sermon could erase that, and so her loneliness grew, for she belonged nowhere entirely, neither the world she had come from, now fading into myth, nor the world she lived in, which tolerated her yet never fully embraced her, and as she entered the threshold of womanhood, whispers spread anew, for her beauty was strange, not the rosy beauty of English maidens but something sharper, her dark hair gleaming with a sheen that caught the light oddly, her eyes deep, set, and reflective, so that when she looked upon someone they often turned away first, unsettled by a gaze that seemed to pierce the veil of ordinary thought, and men who admired her form found themselves hesitant, for to take her hand was to invite the unknown into their bloodline, and though some did not care, others muttered that she was touched, perhaps even changeling, for in those years the belief in fair folk stealing children was strong, and many a tale was told of infants exchanged at birth, leaving behind impostors with strange looks and uncanny habits, and in the girl of Woolpit they saw confirmation of those fears, so that suitors came but rarely, and those who did were discouraged by their families, who whispered of curses and ill fortune, until finally she was left alone, a woman grown yet unclaimed, a figure both admired and avoided, and it was in this solitude that she began to turn inward, meditating upon her memories, trying to grasp the fading threads of that lost country where the light was dim and the fields bore strange crops, and sometimes in half sleep she thought she heard the tolling of bells far underground, echoing as though through stone and water, carrying a melancholy music that stirred her heart to aching, for it spoke of a home both real and unreal, a place she could no longer reach. And as the years went on, the tale of the Green Children was taken up by chroniclers, written into manuscripts, and embellished by traveling storytellers, twisted details for effect, so that while she lived a quiet and mostly unremarkable life, her legend grew beyond her control, spreading to distant shires, even beyond England, where it mingled with older folk tales of subterranean peoples, of fey realms, of hollow hills where time moved strangely. And she, though flesh and blood, became a phantom in the minds of others, her reality and her myth entwined until they could not be untangled. And in this way she bore the weight of two worlds, alive yet already half a story, a ghost of herself while still breathing, and though she carried her pain with grace, there were moments when she wondered whether her brother had been more fortunate to die young, for at least his memory remained pure, untouched by the suspicion, loneliness, and distortions she endured. And this thought, though it shamed her, often pressed upon her heart in the long, dark nights when even the stars seemed distant and unfamiliar, and Woolpit itself, with its quiet lanes and thatched cottages, became less a home than a cage, for everywhere she turned the story of her life was told back to her, until she was no longer herself, but only the echo of a mystery. And thus part two of her tale settled into a deeper, more somber rhythm, a life lived in the shadow of an enigma, neither wholly accepted nor wholly rejected, suspended in the half-light between truth and legend, belonging to all yet possessed by none, a woman of Woolpit, and yet forever not of it. And the years pressed forward, and the girl, no longer called simply the Green Child, but by the name she had chosen for herself among the English, grew into womanhood. The unease that had shadowed her since the days of her childhood did not depart but deepened, for with age came questions, and with questions came long nights of sleeplessness in which she turned over the memories of that hidden land she had once known, the place without sun where all was twilight, and where voices of her people murmured in tones now half forgotten, and she felt within her the ache of displacement, for though she walked among the folk of Woolpit and labored in their fields, though she ate of their bread and drank their ale, a part of her remained unmoored, belonging neither wholly to this world nor to the one she had lost, and that fracture of the soul drew the attention of those who saw her wander the edges of the village with eyes lifted toward the sky, as if searching for something beyond human grasp. And some whispered she consorted with spirits, while others, softer in judgment, said she was touched by God, yet none dared approach her with true closeness, for her difference lingered like a faint perfume that marked her always as other. And in this isolation her inner life grew fierce and rich, for she began to dream strange dreams, visions of her brother standing upon the threshold of the pit, his small hand stretched out as if beckoning her back into the earth. And sometimes she would wake with the taste of iron on her tongue and the memory of green light searing her mind, and she feared that the border between waking and dreaming had thinned for her, that perhaps her own soul was walking places her body could not, and this fear both terrified and compelled her, for she longed to know the truth of what had become of her brother, and whether the land they had come from was still as it had been, or whether time flowed differently there, twisting and changing in ways no mortal mind could reckon. And it was in this state of restlessness that she began to seek out the company of the village priest, a gray-haired man who had heard confessions of murderers and thieves, yet had never before been asked to hear the confessions of one who claimed she had walked out of another world. And he, torn between doubt and awe, listened to her tales of green valleys beneath a sky without sun, of people who lived in a twilight that never lifted, of rivers that glowed faintly as if lit from within, and he counseled her to cling to God and not to shadows. But within himself he wondered whether her words were allegory or truth, and whether the mystery of Woolpit was a test laid upon his flock by heaven or by darker powers. And though he prayed for guidance, no answer came, only silence, the same silence that seemed to hang around the girl like a mantle. and in time her presence began to weigh upon him, for he feared what it might mean if her tale were true, that worlds lay beside their own, close enough that children might stumble through, and if such was the case, then all the certainties of Scripture and earth alike trembled like a reed in the wind. Yet even as the priest wrestled with doubts, the girl found herself more and more haunted by visions that no prayers could quiet, for her brother's face seemed to follow her wherever she went, sometimes pale and drawn with sorrow, sometimes bright with a strange radiance that seemed not of this world, and she began to hear his voice, faint as wind through reeds, calling her name in the dead of night. And though the villagers claimed she merely dreamed, in her heart she knew the call came from beyond, from that half-lit world beneath the earth, and it was not long before tales spread that she wandered in the forest at night, barefoot and silent, as if following some unseen path, and those who glimpsed her whispered that her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, like green fire caught in the lantern of her soul, and the rumors grew that she was a witch, though no harm could be laid at her feet, for crops did not fail nor cattle sicken by her hand. Yet still the unease mounted, until even those who pitied her began to keep their distance, and so she bore her solitude in silence, though within her the longing grew sharper, a gnawing hunger for truth, and at last she resolved to seek it, not in the fields of Woolpit, but at the very mouth of the pits themselves, for she reasoned that if she had come from that hidden world once, perhaps she could find her way back, and though fear shadowed her steps, determination lent her strength, and she went to the hollows where the chalk cliffs fell away and the earth opened into yawning trenches, and she laid her hand upon the cold soil, whispering prayers half remembered from her childhood tongue, words that tasted strange yet familiar upon her lips, and for a moment she thought she felt the earth shiver beneath her, as if something below had stirred, and her heart raced with both terror and hope, and night after night she returned, keeping vigil at the pits, fasting and praying, though to whom she prayed she could not have said, for she no longer knew if it was God or her lost kin she called upon, and as the weeks passed she grew gaunt, her eyes sinking deep into her face, yet her resolve only hardened until one night, beneath a sickle moon, she felt the ground tremble in earnest, and a fissure opened, no wider than the span of her hand, yet deep and dark, and from it rose a glow like the faint shimmer of fireflies, green and pulsing, and she fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, crying out her brother's name, and in that moment she heard his voice clearly, closer than it had ever been, as if he stood just beyond the veil, and he spoke words she could not wholly understand, yet she grasped enough to know he called her to follow, and though fear clawed at her, she pressed her hand into the fissure, feeling the cold breath of that other world upon her skin, and for an instant she thought she might be drawn in, but the earth shuddered and closed, leaving her gasping in the darkness, her hand stained with soil that shimmered faintly like crushed emeralds, and from that night on she bore upon her palm a mark, a faint green circle that no washing could remove, and she knew it was a sign, though of what she dared not speak, for the villagers would have taken it as proof of sorcery, and so she kept her silence, even as the dreams grew more insistent, until she could no longer distinguish waking from sleeping, for at times she would find herself standing miles from the village, with no memory of how she had come there, her feet raw from walking, her voice hoarse from calling her brother's name, and she began to fear she was being drawn back against her will. Yet still she longed for it, for the sorrow of exile was heavier than the dread of return, and so she stood always at the threshold of two worlds, torn between the safety of Woolpit and the pull of the unknown, and it was in this state of unquiet that fate turned again. For one autumn morning a group of travelers passed through the village, scholars from distant lands who had heard whispers of the green children of Woolpit and had come seeking the truth, and when they beheld the girl, now a woman yet still marked by the faint tint of green in her skin and the strange glow of her eyes, they pressed her with questions, speaking of lands far to the east where tales were told of hidden peoples who lived beneath the mountains, and of gateways that opened only to those marked by destiny, and though she answered little, their words struck chords within her, for she felt they touched upon secrets she herself barely understood, and when they left, she felt within her a stirring, as if her path was no longer bound to Woolpit alone, but to something larger, and she knew that soon she would be forced to choose between the world that had taken her in and the world that still called her home, between the life she had built and the mystery that had never released her. And in the silence of her heart she whispered that when the choice came, she would follow the call, even if it led her into the darkness from which she had once emerged. Yet as the seasons turned and the years pressed down upon Woolpit, the woman who had once been a green-skinned child carried within her the weight of two worlds, for though she had grown into her place among the villagers, learned their ways, spoken their tongue, and labored in their fields, she remained always apart, the mark upon her palm burning faintly in the dark, a reminder that her story was not finished, and it was in the bitter winter of her 23rd year that the final chain of events began, when a sickness came creeping into the land, a wasting fever that struck down young and old alike. And though the villagers prayed and burned herbs, nothing availed them, and soon corpses lay stacked by the churchyard wall, their eyes glazed, their mouths frozen in silent cries, and the woman knew with a cold certainty that the sickness was not of this world, but seeped from the hidden one beneath, as if the boundary between the realms had thinned, spilling corruption into the air, and she could no longer ignore the call. Each night she heard her brother's voice louder, clearer, pleading with her to come, to restore what had been broken, and though terror gnawed her bones, she resolved at last to seek the truth with no return, and she went alone into the forest, to the hollows of the pits, where the earth lay scarred and silent, and she cried out in her lost tongue words that rose unbidden from the depths of memory, a chant both prayer and incantation, and as the last syllable left her lips the ground trembled violently, opening into a gaping wound, and from it poured a green light, blinding, terrible, casting shadows that writhed like living things, and she felt herself pulled downward, her body weightless, her soul burning, until she tumbled through the fissure and into the world below. And there she found herself in a vast cavern, its walls shimmering with veins of emerald fire, its air heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like blood on stone, and before her stood her brother, yet not as she remembered him, for though his face was the same, his eyes glowed with an unearthly light, and his body seemed half translucent, as if caught between flesh and spirit, and he spoke her name with such sorrow that her heart broke, for she understood then that he had never truly lived nor truly died, but lingered in bondage to this underworld, a guardian unwilling, chained to forces neither of them understood. And he told her that when they had first emerged into the world above, it had not been by accident but by fracture, for something in Woolpit's soil had cracked the veil, and their passage had unbalanced the realms, demanding a price, and his death had been that price, binding him to the green fire that flowed beneath the earth, while she had been spared, marked with the circle on her palm, chosen as the one who might set the balance right, and she wept, crying that she had neither strength nor wisdom for such a task. But he only laid his hand upon hers, and the green fire in her mark flared so fiercely that it seared her flesh, and in that agony she saw visions, the world above rotting, fields withering, rivers choked with corpses, the sickness spreading until no life remained, and then the underworld itself collapsing, caverns caving in upon the spirits trapped within, until nothing but silence remained between heaven and hell. And she knew that if she did not act, all would be swallowed, and so she begged him to guide her, and he led her deeper into the cavern, through tunnels that twisted like the bowels of the earth, until they came to a great chamber where a pool of liquid light seethed, green as venom, its surface rippling though no wind touched it, and around its edges lay figures half-formed, some human, some beast, their faces twisted in eternal sleep, and she recoiled in horror. But her brother told her this was the root of the sickness, the wound between worlds, and only she could close it, for the mark upon her hand bound her both to the earth above and the realm below, a bridge between the living and the hidden. And though she trembled, she stepped forward, kneeling at the pool, pressing her marked palm against its surface, and the fire surged up her arm, through her body, filling her with ache. Burning so fierce she thought she would be consumed, yet she endured, crying out not in despair but in defiance, calling upon the God of the villagers, the saints she had learned to revere, and also upon the nameless forces of her birthland, weaving together prayers from both worlds. And for a moment all was silence, then the pool convulsed, sucking inward, collapsing upon itself, until the chamber shook with a sound like mountains breaking, and the figures at the pool's edge dissolved into dust, and the light winked out, leaving only darkness. And when she opened her eyes she found herself once more in the fields of Woolpit, lying upon the frozen earth as dawn broke, her palms scarred black where the green circle had been, her skin pale at last, the faint tint gone, as if the fire within her had been quenched, and around her the air was clean, the sickness gone, the field silent but living, and she rose unsteadily, knowing the world had been spared, but also that she was alone, for her brother was gone, his voice silent at last, freed or lost forever she could not say. And though the villagers found her and marveled that she bore no trace of the wasting fever, they never knew the truth of what had passed, for she told no one, carrying her secret like a stone in her heart, and she lived among them as a woman both ordinary and not, working their fields, praying in their church, laughing when laughter was required, yet always with eyes that had seen too much. And when at last she died, many years later, they buried her in the churchyard with prayers and holy rites. But some swore that on the night of her passing, a green light flickered in the sky above the pits, and a whispering like children's laughter echoed from the earth, fading into silence. And to this day the hollows of Woolpit are said to tremble beneath the feet of wanderers, as if something still stirs below, waiting, watching, remembering, for the story of the green children is not one of wonder alone, but of sorrow, of exile, of the thin places where worlds bleed together, and of the price that must always be paid when mortals glimpse the mysteries that lie beyond the veil of earth. Years passed in Woolpit, and the girl who had once been a trembling child of green hue now stood as a woman. Yet though her body grew and her voice matured into the cadence of those around her, the questions that had haunted her from her earliest memory clung like ivy to stone, growing thicker with every season, for no ploughing of the fields, no kneading of bread, no tending of sheep could root them out, and the villagers began to see in her eyes a depth that frightened them, as though she carried within her gaze a memory older than their own lives, and when she would pause at the edge of the fields and stare toward the horizon, they whispered that she was listening to voices they could not hear, for still the dreams came to her, visions of her brother whose small body had wasted away soon after they emerged from the pit, visions of him standing in that twilight land where the sun never shone, his skin still green, his eyes hollow with longing, calling to her across a chasm she could not cross. And sometimes she woke gasping, her fingernails clawing the earth beside her pallet as if she had tried to dig her way back through the soil into that other place. And though she prayed as the priest commanded, though she confessed her doubts and wept in the chapel, no peace came, only the certainty that she belonged neither wholly here nor wholly there, caught between two worlds like a moth circling ever closer to a flame. And the people of Woolpit, though they came to accept her presence, never truly embraced her, for she was marked by strangeness, and even those who treated her with kindness did so with the distance one shows a wounded bird that might yet die. And so she grew into a woman apart, her life tinged with solitude, yet her spirit sharpened by longing. And when men of the village sought her hand in marriage, she refused them gently, saying her heart was bound elsewhere, though she could not explain to them that it was bound not to any living man, to a mystery that pulled at her soul, the mystery of the land beneath the earth and the fate of her brother. And as she aged, she came to understand that Woolpit itself had changed because of her, that the story of the green children had begun to spread beyond the village, carried by merchants and travelers, told in the courts of lords and the halls of monasteries, and with each telling her image grew stranger, more mythical, until some said she was a fairy child, others that she was a demon's daughter, and still others that she was a sign from God, meant to warn of hidden realms. And though she herself lived humbly, her legend swelled like a tide that could not be stopped, and she sometimes wondered whether her life had become less her own and more a tale spun by others, and in this she saw a kind of fate unfolding, a fate she could not deny, for perhaps she had been brought Woolpit not merely to survive, but to remind the people that their world was not as fixed and firm as they believed, that the earth itself hid mysteries that could not be tilled or tamed, and this thought both comforted and frightened her, for if the boundaries between worlds were thin enough for children to pass through, then perhaps they were thin enough for darker things as well. And on certain nights when the wind howled over the fields and the pit gaped black in the moonlight, she would stand at its edge and feel the soil tremble faintly beneath her feet, as though something were stirring far below, waiting, listening, perhaps even calling her name. Yet the girl who had become a woman and the woman who had become a legend felt that no matter how much she tilled the earth or walked among the villagers, she would always stand on that threshold where two worlds touched. And as age crept upon her, silvering her hair and drawing her shoulders down, she found herself speaking more openly of the land of twilight, of the tunnels that seemed endless, of the faint hum that had always filled the air there. A sound like a distant bell struck beneath the soil, and some who listened dismissed her words as the wandering of memory, while others recorded them carefully, fearing that if they did not, the truth of her tale would fade. But still none could answer the question of how she and her brother had come to Woolpit, nor why their skin had borne that strange hue of green that only faded after long years of living on the food of this world. And so the story twisted, like vines wrapping around a ruined wall, branching into speculation and myth, until in monasteries it was written that the children came from a place called St. Martin's Land, a land of perpetual dusk where all the people were green and Christian in name though not in practice, while in taverns it was whispered that they had crawled up from hell itself, spared only because they were too young to bear the sins of demons, and in cottages mothers told their children that if they strayed too near the pits of Woolpit, they might be stolen away into another world, returning changed, or perhaps never returning at all. And so fear entwined with wonder, and her very existence became a cautionary tale. Yet she herself remained haunted not by what others said, but by the memory of her brother's small hand slipping from hers as his strength failed in those first hungry weeks, by the sound of his breathing growing shallower until it was gone, by the emptiness in her arms when she tried to hold him and found only silence. And though she lived on, though she worked and prayed and grew old, she carried him always, and in dreams she saw him still wandering that dim land, waiting, calling, and she began to feel that her life in Woolpit was not an ending but only a pause, that one day when her body at last grew weary enough to release her, she would find herself once more in those shadowed fields where the light was neither day nor night, and she would see him standing there, no longer a child, no longer hungry, but whole, and together they would walk beyond the horizon she had never reached in her dreams. And so when her time finally came, she lay upon her bed and the priest murmured prayers over her, and the villagers whispered that the green child was dying, she smiled faintly, for she felt the soil beneath her stir, the earth opening like a door, and she knew she was not ending but returning. And though her body was laid in Woolpit's ground, the story of the green children lived on, passing from voice to voice, from parchment to book, until it became one of the strangest and most enduring mysteries of England. And even centuries later, long after Woolpit's pits had grown over with grass and the village itself had changed beyond recognition, still the tale was told, and still scholars puzzled, and still children listened with wide eyes, half afraid, half enthralled, wondering whether somewhere beneath their feet another world waited, a world of twilight and green-skinned people, a world from which, on rare and fateful days, lost children might emerge into the sunlight, carrying with them the silence of mysteries that could never be fully explained. And so the legend endured, not merely as a curiosity of medieval chronicles, but as a whisper reminding all who heard it that the boundaries of their world were thinner than they believed, that the earth could open at any time and reveal truths both wondrous and terrible. And thus the lost children of Woolpit remained forever caught between history and myth, between sorrow and wonder, between this world and the next, their story echoing like that distant hum beneath the soil, a sound that never ceased, a sound that still calls to those who dare to listen.